Hello and welcome to today's webinar, GDPR Compliance, What You Need to Know Before May 2018. I'm Kristen Zurovich and I'll be your moderator for the webcast. But before I introduce our featured speaker, I'd like to share a couple housekeeping items with you. First of all attendees are in listen-only mode, which means you are currently muted. But if you recall, as part of the registration process for this webinar, we did ask you to pre-submit questions for our guest speaker. I'm happy to share with you that we actually received many really good questions, which will allow us to tailor today's webcast to you. I'll be sharing several of these questions with our guests throughout the webinar, but then at the end of the webcast, time permitting of course, we'll take your additional questions. Now, judging by the size of the registration that we have for this event and the interest that I've seen so far in GDPR, I anticipate we'll probably not have time today for all the questions. And if that is the case, we'll definitely respond to you directly after the webinar. But with that, I'd like to introduce today's featured speaker, Susan Morrow. Susan has worked in the IT security sector since the early 90s, providing research and consulting across a diverse area of technology, including encryption, digital rights management, digital signing, privacy, and online identity. She has been involved in security projects addressing government, enterprise, and consumer needs, and has helped design and commercialize award-winning security software that's used by organizations of all sizes worldwide. She has patents pending for security software-related inventions and has published a number of papers in the data security area. Currently, Susan is working as head of R&D at Abaco Secure, who are specialists in online identity, and her mantra is that security is about human beings as much as it is about technology. Welcome to the webinar, Susan.
Hi, thank you for that, Kristen. The GDPR. Okay, I'm going to do my best to give you as much information as I can about what is a very complex and nuanced regulation. And we'll go through a number of areas within the GDPR, and I'll talk to some of the questions that have been asked, which have been very interesting and very pertinent questions. And when I go through, I'll talk about things like what the data types are, because it's a very important part of it. We'll look at the personal data rights side of the GDPR, and we'll look at the business requirements that come out of that. We'll look at the consequences of non-compliance as well, which I know everybody's very worried about, myself including. And we'll also look at just some basic steps that you can go through to start at least the process of becoming compliant, because it is a process and it's not a one-stop, once you're done type of regulation. And then I'll pass over to Kristen again, and she'll talk about some of the personal training requirements needed for the GDPR. So what is the GDPR, apart from frightening the life out of all of us? It is the General Data Protection Regulation, and it is something that has evolved from the earlier Data Protection Directive, which came out around about 1995, and there's a lot changed since 1995. The internet is now ubiquitous. Data is continuously used online to transact, to do jobs online, and a lot of that data is personal and very sensitive. And the GDPR tries to take all of this into account. So it's about evolving the current regulation to become more modern and take into account the more modern use of data in a much more ubiquitous connected system. And it details about how that data needs to be handled, the processing of that data. When you're processing that data, what you have to do to make sure that you respect the individual's rights to their data. It's all about respecting the individual's right to their personal data. What's not to like, we say. But if you don't meet those requirements, and they're nuanced and they're not, necessarily onerous for everybody, however you need to recognise who they are onerous for, then if you don't meet that compliance, then there are fines, and they're quite heavy fines compared to the previous directive. And they set out new requirements as well for breach notifications, which we didn't really have in the kind of detail that we have in the GDPR previously. So we'll start with the data types, because that's a good place to start. So there's two basic data types recognised in GDPR. There are personal data. Now, what personal data really is about having linkability. It's about being able to take a piece of data and being able to identify a person from one or two pieces of data. So, the usual PII is covered by personal data. It's important, though, to note that the GDPR is it defines personal data, not PII. PII is more of a US definition, whereas personal data is much more encompassing within GDPR than PII. It's not just PII. So personal data is anything that can identify an individual. Your name, your address, your email address, your phone number. It's also something like your IP address as well, which is a sort of an area of contention for a lot of people. But they say that if you have someone's IP address and you have their first name, you could potentially identify that person. So you need to be wary of what constitutes personal data. And the next category is sensitive personal data. It's called a special category. And that is information that is, it covers more of your personal lifestyle. So things like, are you a member of a trade union? What are your religious beliefs? And it also covers things like genetic data and your race or ethnic origin. Biometric data is covered in personal data, but it's also covered in sensitive personal data as well. The special category. So it's sometimes it has dual application, so you need to be wary of that. So when you're starting to look at GDPR in your context of your business, you need to remember these two different categories. So what is the GDPR based on? So the legal basis for the GDPR is consent. And consent is really just a way of, you can think of it as a way of building a relationship with the person who actually owns the data, who the data represents. So consent is really, it's kind of like an umbrella for the rest of the GDPR. If you can get consent right, you're halfway there towards getting the GDPR, your business into the GDPR compliance. Consent's a big thing, though, and we can talk about consent entirely in this hour. But you have to think of it as about how you gain your consent from the people, your employees, your clients, your customers. How you gain consent to collect their data, to share their data, to process their data, to use their data for marketing purposes, and so on. So it's about that collection of consent, and that impacts right across your business, because it's from the very beginning where people start interacting with it at the UI level, right through the processing and the life cycle of that data. Things like opt-out buttons, which we have used since the internet became the internet, since we started using it, opt-out buttons are a big no-no in the GDPR under most circumstances. There are some circumstances, and this is where it gets nuanced, where you can use opt-out, but they're very, very unusual, and they're more to do with emailing business partners, that type of thing. In the main, opt-out is a no-no. Now, within the umbrella of consent, you have the data rights of the EU citizen. And the data rights there's a number of them, and they all come under the auspice of what people tell you are allowed to do with their data and how they can access that data. So access is an important thing. And if you think about it, if you're a company who regularly collects customer data, you've got a website that collects data and it creates a customer account, you have to give people rights of access to that data, and you also have to give them rights of portability of that data. So if someone says, look, I want you to send this data to a company X on my behalf, you have to do that. Now there are recognition within the GDPR itself to that you can't if there's someone has an unusual system that you can't interface with. You know, the GDPR tries to be as flexible as it can within the constraints of it trying to encourage consent and respect for personal data usage. You know, it does have some flexibility, you know, so we'll come back to that later. You also need the right to be forgotten. Now, this is a very contentious right. It's also called erasure, and this says that if I say to you, right, okay, get rid of any information you have on me, that's it, that's the end of our relationship, then you have to not only get rid of the information that you store with me, but any information that you might have shared with third parties on my behalf, you also have to make sure that those third parties erase that information as well. And that can be tricky in certain circumstances because, you know, if you've, you know, use it to, you've got website links, for example, that, you know, share or take someone to something that could potentially be construed as personal data, you'll need to somehow deal with that as well. So this right to be forgotten is a problem. But again, there are derogations within the GDPR to, you know, give you as much flexibility as possible around this. So, you know, if it's going to cause disproportionate effort, that's the phrase they use, disproportionate effort to do this, then you can probably give good reason not to do it. And that comes down to one of the main things of the GDPR is that you need to be able to demonstrate things. Bear that in mind, demonstrate. The other thing that is important in GDPR is the right to rectification and the right to object, which are kind of interlinked. So if you've got data that is incorrect, you have to be able to quickly make changes to that data to bring it up to date and correct. And also users can object to things like profiling. So if you're using data for marketing purposes and you know, profile them as a, you know, a woman between the ages of X and Y, you know, then they can object to the use of their data for that type of thing. Now, sorry.
Susan, before you move on, if you want to just go back to the previous slide, I had a question that came in that is relevant to number 3 on your list, which is the right to be forgotten. The question is, how can companies fulfill the obligation of the right to be forgotten? For example, if a company is forced to use an old backup, does old personal data found in these backups compromise GDPR?
Yes. Anything, any personal data that is held on that person, as long as it doesn't take undue effort. So if and you'd have to prove undue effort. As long as if that data is personal data to that person or in a special category, and they ask you to remove it, then you're going to have to do that. But if it's going to be, you know, if the data is, if it's a hard disk that's 15 years out of date, you can't get onto it, then, you know, the chances are that nobody else can, and you can probably prove that. So, you know, you just have to be cognizant of there are relaxations within that if it's going to be very, very difficult for you to do, or it's going to cost an enormous amount of money for you to do that.
Very good. Before we move on, several questions kind of in the same vein that I'm going to group together, and just a general question I think covers all of them. Several viewers today and prior to the webinar have asked about GDPR as it relates to third-party SaaS solutions, so things like Salesforce or Amazon. A couple different questions here. One is, what fail-safes would you recommend for relying on a third-party system to comply with GDPR? For example, making sure clients' info has been removed. And then there's a second part to the question, which I'll ask you in a bit.
Okay, so you have to be able to demonstrate safeguards are in place with third-party vendors. People like, you know, Salesforce and AWS, they have done a lot of work to make sure that they are in compliance with GDPR and that you can be in compliance by, you know, by using them. And if you go to any of their websites, you'll be able to find all of the information that you need on what procedures they've put in place to do that. So as long as you can demonstrate that you have safeguards in place because a third party companies that you use have met those requirements, then that's the main thing that you have to show with GDPR compliance.
Sure.
Demonstrate. Yeah.
And then in the same vein, an add-on question to that is, do GDPR rules apply to where the data rests or where it is accessed from?
So it's both, because that's part of the processing of the data. So if the data, the main thing is that if the data represents an EU citizen, so it could be on Mars, and if it represents an EU citizen, then it has to be protected, and it has to be accessible, and it has to be able to be erased, etc., etc. It has to be able to meet those requirements.
Very good. And then one question that I think is pertinent to this slide before we move on that just came in from Glenn. He asks, if a person has previously agreed to allow their data to be shared with third parties, but then asks to have it removed after GDPR comes into force, do you still have to contact all the third parties and deal with that request?
That's a very good question. I would say yes. I mean, I would double check that with probably. The thing is, a lot of these things are going to fall under case law as things pan out. That's one that's going to affect a lot of people. Now, I would guess that yes, because you have to demonstrate that even pre-existing systems have to come under the GDPR regulations. So you have to meet compliance even with pre-existing systems. So any information that is pre-existing should still have the right kind of protections in place. Things like consent. I mean, I suppose that brings into the question, do you go back and capture consent from people who've already shared your data? It really does depend on how much data you're processing and how long you've held that data. But I would guess that a lot of people are now trying to do exactly that. They're now trying to get consents from people that they've already got data for. But again, these are things that are going to, it's case law and they're going to pan out over time. Personally, I would try and get as much in place as I could. But sometimes, again, if you can show, it's about demonstrating that you've tried, and if it's just going to be too difficult, you can't get in touch with people and so on and so forth. I don't think the GDPR are purposely going to go out and fine everybody, 20 million euros at the drop of a hat. They just want to see that you are putting processes and procedures in place to do this. Very good.
Let's move on, Susan, and talk a little bit more about GDPR.
Right, okay, so there are a number of sort of roles within the GDPR that also cause confusion for people. And there's this idea of this sort of separation of data processors and data controllers. And again, this is on a sort of, your company has to take this on a sort of, it's very individual to a company, this. But typically a data processor is someone who has direct obligations under the GDPR, this is. So they must demonstrate that the controls are in place. So they process the data, if you like, on behalf of the controller, and they could be cloud systems. It could be like, cloud repositories, document management systems, that type of thing. Data controllers, so they have control over the processing, and they have data protection responsibility. If you like, they look at the whys and the hows of data use. Both of them have responsibilities, but you need to understand, which one your organisation does, because it's not necessarily clear. So, for example, a bank would typically be a controller, and they might share information or use a cloud data center as a repository to process the information, in which case they would have very distinct roles. Sometimes it's a bit fuzzier than that, but again, it just depends. So if you can get your head around which pieces your company does or doesn't do in that, then at least you know what your responsibilities are. So this brings me on to the sort of regulations. So you may need to appoint a data protection officer, DPO, but you may not. It depends. So, for example, smaller companies, that is companies under 250 employees, they may need to. You only really need a DPO if you're doing a lot of data processing, if you're collecting a lot of data and you're doing a lot of data processing. Now that might be that you might be a small organisation, it might only have 5 or 6 people, but you might have a website that brings in massive traffic and you do a lot of sales through it, in which case, even though you're a very small company, you're going to have at least the ability to reach out to someone who's a consultant to get advice from them. But in general, employees with under 250, companies with under 250 employees have a more relaxed sort of expectation from GDPR in terms of DPO use. They are useful people though to have on board, even if it's just as a sort of ad hoc consultant. So the DPO has sort of a number of duties. If you do take one on board, I mean, you're talking here, if you are doing like large scale processing of special categories, that type of thing, you will have to have one. If you do take one on board, they will basically look at the regulatory requirements and processes. They will be people who, they will look after your staff training, what your staff training has to be, because the GDPR does expect a level of data protection awareness within your organisation. Your employees need to understand what they can and can't do under GDPR law. So the DPO would be able to typically advise on that, or you know, if you're using them on an ad hoc basis, they'd be able to advise you on that. Like I said, some organisations are exempt. So if you don't handle personal data at all, obviously you are. But if you handle a reasonable number of customers or employees, or you have a lot of, you're part of a supply chain, for example, you may find that having a DPO is something that you have to do. So do check that. You also have to do, so as part of that, so you've set up all of your roles, you know where your data is, you know what data you're processing, you have to do information audits, and these are ongoing. So it's not as just so you'll do your initial one, and you'll check the types of data that you really need to bring in, and then you will have to perform ongoing information audits from that. And you also are expected to carry out a data protection impact assessment, a DPIA. So they will basically evaluate the sort of origin, nature, the severity of the risk and the rights that are being applied to GDPR expectations. That's what the DPIA does. So it's kind of all part and parcel of the same process that you're going through.
Good. I'm going to pause once again, Susan, for a couple of questions that came relative to the content on this slide. I know you touched on this briefly, but maybe you can elaborate just a tad more. Several questions related to the size of certain viewers' organizations. So to summarize, they're all essentially asking about the same thing. They see how GDPR compliance is a priority for large and even medium-sized companies, but for those that work for a relatively small business, does GDPR affect their organizations in the same way? Or, as someone asked, do I need to pursue compliance with the same level of rigor as a large organization or a multinational company?
So the GDPR states that SMEs have to comply with GDPR regulations. So anybody, even if you've got one employee, you have to comply with GDPR, but only if you collect and process personal data or special category data. And unless you are doing that on quite a large scale, then the regulations are much more relaxed. So there's certainly the documentation expectations of GDPR are much more relaxed if you're not doing it in, I don't know what I can't tell you what the, so it talks about large scale processing of data. I do not know in terms of figures what that is, and I cannot find it anywhere. So this is something that someone like a DPO would be able to advise on. But yes, certainly, if you're under 250 employees, the regulations are relaxed in certain areas, specifically documentation. So that would include audit. You'd still have to go through audit and DPIA, but it's much more relaxed about it. And if you're not processing a lot of data, the chances are that you're really going to not have to do as much of you're not going to have to do as much of the regulatory compliance expectations as someone who is processing, 10,000 customers a day.
Sure. Kevin had made a comment on this slide. You indicate that EU organizations may need to do these things, and he's wondering, would US organizations need to do these things as well?
If the US organization has EU employees or EU customers, or that even if your website is geared towards trying to encourage EU customers to come into it. So, for example, you might have a version of your website that is in Dutch. See, that means you're encouraging Dutch citizens to come in. So you have to meet certain requirements, and one of those things, so the GDPR is not just about how you process data; it's about how you collect data and how you interact with the people, like data that you collect. And so things like privacy policies would have to come into line with GDPR. Things like your consent mechanism when you do collect data would have to reflect. Now, if you think about it, you might have a global website. You might mainly have American or Australian or whatever customers, but if you're still marketing to European customers and you have to meet GDPR, chances are you're going to have to do it for the whole website as well. You're going to have those consents. You're going to have to change the privacy policy, because otherwise you'd have different versions for different countries. So yeah, you're going to have to.
Okay, I'm going to go into rapid fire mode with you, Susan, so we can answer very quickly a couple other questions before we move on, because we still have a fair amount to get through today. So Daniel's asking about if we keep strict segregation of data, meaning EU data is stored only in our EU data center, does the US or does our US-based entity need to also be compliant?
If the EU data touches that US data center, then yes. If it doesn't, if it's completely isolated, then no, I don't think so.
Okay.
It would have to be, it depends on where it comes in. I'd have to look at the actual data life cycle to give a definitive answer, but that's the best I can do on that one.
Sure. And then one last question about individuals or organizations that are affected by GDPR. Real quickly, do clients from the UK fall under GDPR?
Well, we're still in the Europe at the minute, and we will be at least until May 2019, so I believe. So for the time being, yes. So we're going to have to get into GDPR compliance because it comes in May next year. So we're going to have to. And even then, the DPA in the UK is coming into alignment with the GDPR, so that we're going to have pretty much the same expectations anyway. So we're going to have to do whatever.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's keep going.
Okay. Oh well, we've already said this. If you've got one EU-based client or employee, you're subject to GDPR compliance. But just to reiterate, if you're not processing volumes of data, the regulations are relaxed. Not as much documentation is expected. So it's not the end of the world. You're not going to have to think, oh my dear God, how am I going to cope with this? They are relaxed. So what if you don't comply? I know this is, it is awful when you look at it, but just bear in mind that they are trying to achieve something that is good in our world, but they are relaxing certain aspects of the GDPR, but they are also trying to make sure that we do adhere to this. And the way that data breaches are going at the minute, it's just crazy. It's out of control. So this is EU's way of controlling this. So there's two levels of fine. The smaller one, which is around things like if you have a data breach or you're not employing the services of DPO, when you need to employ the services of a DPO, okay, or not conducting a DPIA, that sort of thing. When you're out of kilter with those, then the maximum fine you can get is 10 million euros or 2% of global annual revenue, whichever's higher. And the bigger level, the higher level is 4% of global annual revenue, or 20 million. And that's for things like failing to gain consent, which is interesting because it shows how important consent is in the GDPR. And if you can get consent right, then you've won half the battle. And consent is actually, I actually work on developing consent management systems. And it's very, very complicated. Trust me, I do understand this. But you can get it right in, you know, just the way that you present. Consent has to be an affirmative action. So you have to say, yes, I definitely do this. And you have to be really clear in your language. And another useful thing with consent is to keep audits. This is all part of the documentation. Keep audits of the consents that you're taking and allow people to revoke consent. And if you do those things, then you've got quite the way down, you know, the route of compliance with GDPR, and you won't need to worry too much about these scary fines. So these are just some sort of steps to go through, just to remind you that getting into compliance is just a process that you have to go through. And so if you break it down into little steps, then it just makes things a bit less scary and a bit more controllable and a bit more manageable. So the first step is to just know what your data is, why you're collecting that data. Do you need to collect it? Because if you don't need to collect it, just don't. You know, and also work out those two categories. Remember those two categories as well. Step two is to understand why you need to process the data, and also do you really need to carry out the processes? So, for example, you might be using it to profile. Do you really need to do that? And you also need to understand what will happen to it as it goes through the life cycle. And this is where, you know, you can start to look at the types of technology that you might want to put into place, because in the GDPR there are relaxations around things like pseudonymization and anonymization of data. If you can get data anonymized, you're laughing, because once you've got anonymized, and I say this knowing that anonymization of data is extremely difficult, true anonymization, then the GDPR says, okay, that's right. If you've anonymized that data, you've met all the requirements. However, mostly data is pseudonymized, and the pseudonymization of data only means relaxation of some of the compliance requirements. And so consent's really, really important to think about. So this affects so much of your system. It affects your user interfaces, how you take consent, you know, what you say to people. It has to be that affirmative action, clear language, but also things like audit. So consent receipts. Consent receipts are something that's quite new in the industry to think about. Consent receipts show both you and your customer or client that, you know, they have got that receipt, they have given that consent, and there's no argument about it. That's affirmative. Revocation, you have to be able to revoke consent. And also you need to be able to build privacy policies and potentially security policies that reflect the whole of the consent model that you build into your system. And then once you have your head around the consent, then you can look at the way that you're going to apply rights. And you know, there are some complications in here, because it will impact the interface between you and your customer, whether that interface is, you know, in just a website or some other, you know, some other system, you're going to have to think about those rights to erasure and those rights to access data, to port data to someone else, and so on and so forth. So it will impact how your business runs and how your business operates. But if you start off simple with what data am I collecting and why am I collecting it, once you've got to this stage, at least you'll know what it is that you have to do with that data and how you can make it more accessible to the person who's actually originated it. So one of the things that might be useful is that some pre-existing regulations and laws you might already have, and also certifications you might already have in place. So, for example, HIPAA or PSD2 or ISO 27001, you might already have gone through these anyway. And if you have, there's a fair chance that you've already got some of these systems that are required by GDPR in place. So it's probably worth mapping out, you know, what you've already got in place and seeing if there's any gaps that you can fill. And then, last but not least, you're supposed to have implemented all of the changes by May the 25th, 2018. So this is all about documentation, audit and training. You have to get those things in place. You have to have gone through these processes and documented it, and you have to be prepared to, if you are not meeting a requirement, you have to be prepared to say why. So that would cost my company $10 million to remove one piece of information. You know, you have to be able to prove the reasons why you've taken steps to come out of compliance, and they have to be able to stand up in court. I don't know if there's any questions at this point, Kristen?
There are a couple, and all good steps. Thanks for sharing those. One of the questions comes from Lori, who's asking which regulations of those that you've covered have the highest visibility and the highest impact? And by that question, I think she's probably asking, you know, where do I focus my energies first?
Consent. Okay, because that's the umbrella that everything else falls under. Work out where you need to take consents, how you take the consents, and how you manage the consents. Work out those things, first of all. And then the citizen rights, things like erasure, it can be a complicated one to understand how to apply. Have a look at erasure in light of how you process data. And data, things like data portability can also be potentially complicated. If you have data access, you might be able to cover data portability through a user-centric mechanism. Those are the ones that I would concentrate on first.
Very good. And then one other question before we move on. Will there be an accreditation audit for GDPR?
So there's not an official one yet, but I'd be surprised if certifications didn't come out. So in the same way that we have, you know, the safe harbour, we had lots of bodies that would certify. They're not necessarily regulated certificates, but having them in place as a way of proving, it's a demonstrable proof that you have made steps towards compliance. So, and there are people starting to now, you know, offer certain aspects of GDPR compliance certification. But as for regulated, not yet. I'd be surprised if there were.
Sure, sure. Thanks for that. Let's keep going.
Okay, so GDPR, as I said earlier, GDPR, the EU isn't trying to be, I don't think they're trying to be evil, although some people might disagree with that. But you know, this is all about bringing everything up to date, because as organisations, we're starting to suffer from data breaches. So as individuals, we suffer from data breaches, and the GDPR is all about protecting the individual, but at the same time, it actually protects our business as well. So for example, rectification of data breaches. So the Ponemon Institute, who do a lot of work in this area and you know, work with thousands of companies looking at costs of data breaches, they found that a single record costs about $141 on average to rectify. So if you've got 10,000, you know, breached records, then it's obviously going to cost your company a lot of money. And then there's your company reputation. I mean, look what happened with Uber and with Equifax. It's embarrassing. People leave in their droves, and you know, your company has to pick up the pieces from that data breach. And because privacy is becoming such a big topic in the world now as well, if you're GDPR compliant, you can show that, look, I care about your privacy, and people care back when you show that. One of the other things, of course, related to that is that once you've lost customer trust, you know, they then often will come back at you with, you know, legal action. People like Target, who were breached a few years ago, have had massive class actions taken out against them, several class actions taken out against them, and it's costing them year on year on year because of that breach. And also, of course, your share value goes down. I mean, there was a study by Oxford Economics which found that it dropped on average 1.8% after a cyber attack, but Equifax, I think at its worst, it dropped something like 32% within a week of the breach. So it's as well as looking after customers and clients and so on, it's actually in our own interests as well to do this. And one of the things that the GDPR mandates, and I think this is very important actually, and I'm glad that they've put it in, they have a mandate to make sure that your staff are aware of what the GDPR is about and the processing of data and what that involves and what the rights are of the individual. And they expect appropriate data training, protection training and security awareness training to take place in your organisation. And I think at this point I'm passing over to you, Kristen.
Sure. So as Susan mentioned previously, you know, part of GDPR is this area of personnel training, and SecurityIQ by InfoSec Institute can actually help you fulfill the personnel training requirements under GDPR. As I just give a quick overview of what SecurityIQ is, it's essentially a security education platform for your entire workforce that integrates role-based security awareness training with real-life phishing simulations and automatically personalized learning plans for each employee. It integrates all that into a single, easy-to-use platform. So our ultimate goal is to help you prevent data breaches by boosting your employees' security aptitude and helping transform their security behaviors. With SecurityIQ, our clients have demonstrated drops in their phishing susceptibility rates to near 0%. But let's talk a little bit about one of the ways that SecurityIQ can actually help you fulfill GDPR's personnel training requirements, and that is through our privacy and EU GDPR training module, which is included in the platform, and it covers all the education components that you see here. So it makes your employees or your workforce familiar with what GDPR is, what the purpose of it is. It talks about the different types of protected data types and the information lifecycle for that data. Also talks a bit about the non-compliance consequences, what it actually means for the organization that's employing them if a breach does occur or if they are non-compliant. And then it talks through your data protection principles and best practices and personal data rights. So all of that is encompassed in our privacy and EU GDPR training module. And here's just a quick example of some of the GDPR training modules that we have. What our clients really appreciate with SecurityIQ is how it often automates what's the what's seen as a tedious program development and ongoing management for security awareness initiatives. Program managers often find that to implement this kind of training and build it from scratch can be very time consuming. You have to keep it up to date and refreshed. But with SecurityIQ, we actually provide a lot of those elements for them out of the box. So first of all, we provide them more than 130 frequently updated training modules. Over 200 real-world phishing simulation templates. All of these are ready to use out of the box or can be customized as you need to. So again, taking the heavy lifting off of you of having to build from scratch your own security awareness program. But more importantly, SecurityIQ continually monitors and tracks your employees' learning progress and security behaviors. It uses this data to automatically create personalized security education experiences for each employee. And by doing that, it can provide the right level of training, the right level of reinforcement at the right time and the right frequency to make sure that they're always engaged and motivated, and security and data protection is always top of mind for them. So I encourage you to give SecurityIQ a try and see it for yourself. If you're interested, simply go to securityiq.infosecinstitute.com and you can get started with a free account. We'll also add this to the links area where you can actually just click on that link. But with that, Susan, I think we have time. We have about 10 minutes or so to take maybe a few other questions that we didn't get to during the webinar. And
Okay.
let's do that right now. There is a question here which I think is interesting from Dan. And just to frame it, he says that they're a small 50-person professional services company. He says, we do not process any EU or UK data, but they have UK-based insurance underwriters. All of the data is for US-based customers and resides on US-based systems. Can we be compliant by simply using email encryption when our staff is sending email messages to their vendor colleagues in London? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good place to start because that actually shows that you're attempting to protect data. There is, now I know that there is some relaxation around B2B type data processing. And I think it's specifically for this type of scenario. Now I would double check that, but I'm pretty sure that there is some relaxation. You may need to have a mechanism to consent, but so what one of the GDPR things is that you must have affirmative consent. You can't just have implied consent. And I do know that with emails between companies, so the email might contain, you know, it's certainly an email address, phone number probably at some point, and so on. So as long as I think email encryption would definitely tick a GDPR box, and I think that you'd probably be fine. But obviously, double check everything I'm saying. But that's pretty good. It's a pretty good start.
Very good. Another question here is about erasure, which you had talked about, and it's when there's a request to erase a past employee record, do we need to get rid of PII or personally identifiable information from historical data such as audit trails?
Yes, you do. In fact, audit trails shouldn't really contain personal data. They should be at least pseudonymized. So check that. Check that your audit trails are currently pseudonymized or not. Because pseudonymization under GDPR rules allows you to have a bit more of a relaxed stance. But absolutely, if there's any personal information in audit trails, absolutely that has to be part of the erasure.
Wonderful. In what way does GDPR compliance differ from ISO 27001 standards?
Well, if you've got ISO 27001, then you will have some of the measures in place for GDPR compliance, but not all of them, because ISO 27001 doesn't, for example, it doesn't have any, at least last time I looked, it didn't have any requirements for consent, for affirmative consent, and you know, so that there's an area straight off, or for, you know, erasure. for example, and so on. So you'll be some way towards it, but not all of the way. That's where this gap analysis comes in.
Good, very good. Another question here, this one comes from David. He says, when looking at the GDPR requirements, it's plain to see how they conflict with numerous other standards and requirements. How do you suggest overcoming this hurdle?
It is. I know PSD2 is kind of all about, you know, protecting access, whereas GDPR is about encouraging access. You have to have the right to access data. But they're kind of two sides of the same coin. The best thing to do is, it is a tricky one. I'm not going to try and make light of it. The best thing that you can do really is to look at them like that. It's like looking at security and privacy. Security and privacy are often in conflict, and but the two sides of the same coin. So there are areas of PSD2 that mean that you comply with GDPR and vice versa. You are going to have to look at things like access and consent, and try and square the round. It's gonna. I'm not going to make light of it. There are some tricky areas, but there are also some overlap as well.
Sure. And a question here from Elizabeth: will a company be required to provide proof that personal data has been removed?
Yeah, so the GDPR is about documentation and audit. So yeah, you need to have that in place, because if someone, you need to have that anyway, because if someone contradicts you, you need to be able to stand up in a court of law and prove it.
Right, very good. There's a multi-part question here from Akib, and I'll lay out the entire 3 parts to it first, and then we can kind of jump in if you need a refresher. But he asks, first of all, when will GDPR compliance be assessed by the regulators? Is there a possibility of an extension of the deadline? And is there a possibility of regulated audits for compliance similar to SOX?
The deadline is the deadline, and I've not seen any indication that they're going to waver on it. Many people wish they would, but we have had several years now of you know, it coming on board. So I doubt it. And as far as regulated certification and auditing goes, there are, like I mentioned this earlier, there are people who offer to do certification around GDPR that might be useful in documenting and proving and demonstrating that you are GDPR compliant, but it's not regulated. Whether it becomes regulated or not, honestly, I don't know. I haven't seen, you can see in a lot of other areas that they don't tend to do that. I don't think the DPT ever did. So I'd be surprised, but they might, but probably not. But when you're getting certification for, you know, the GDPR can cover quite a lot of different areas. You need to make sure that you get someone who actually understands the whole thing, because it is very nuanced in parts, and there may be areas that you can become much more relaxed about, rather than, you know, having a heavy hand, because it is going to cost a lot of time and money to get in full compliance for certain organisations, and you might be able to get away with more relaxed compliance if you get the right person to advise you.
Thank you. Patrick is wondering if you can provide specific examples of compliant opt-in and data collection procedures. I know that can be quite broad, but is there anything just top of mind that comes to you?
You mean someone who does it well?
Right.
That's a tricky one. Now, I work with the UK government on a system called Verify, which is a digital identity system, and we have had to be very careful about consent and opt-in from before GDPR. We are now GDPR compliant within that, and also are the other systems within that. So it's probably worth, if you can get onto that, having a look at some of the people. So you'd have to go to the UK government site and use the Verify system to have a look at the types of privacy policies and clear language. The UK government have a service called the GDS, or Government Digital Services, and they spend their life researching things like usability and the UX of systems and how to make things clear, which is quite unusual for a government. But they do spend a lot of time on this, so it's probably worth looking at them. People like AWS, they have really spent a lot of time looking at GDPR. Have a look at their policies and their recommendations, and they've got a lot of blog posts about that. And yeah, I mean, anybody who has anybody in Europe, any European company who you know is a very large company, so someone like a big company who has a lot of customers, look at what they're doing now, and if it's a very affirmative and very clear language, you know that they've gone somewhere to meet GDPR.
Very good. And we're coming up against our time, but we have time for one last question. And this is one that was submitted by several individuals before the webinar. And you know, it's really, I think, going to be helpful for everyone. And it's whether there's an easy reference or cheat sheet for GDPR requirements that organizations can follow. And Susan, you know, because we had chatted about this before the webinar, if you want to bring up that last slide, that will provide a link. You'll also see the link in the chat of a checklist that's available. And I don't know if you want to mention a little bit, Susan, about what this checklist is and who prepared it and how it might be helpful.
So the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK have tried to demystify GDPR and have done a lot of work in this area, and I really have, spent some time trying to make it as simple as possible, because it is very. If you read through, and if you've got a few hours spare, if you can scan through the GDPR, you'll see it's not terribly legalese, but it is very nuanced in areas. So the ICO try to get around this, and what they've got is they've got a really good, I think it's a 12-step kind of wizard type system that you can go through to see where you've met, GDPR compliance or not. And I think Kristen, you've got this in your GDPR readiness link here. You will have a link to that ICO site.
Correct. And for those of you that have asked, yes, we are recording today's webinar. You will receive an email later today with a link to the recording, and we'll also include in there the link here that several of you have asked for. So with that, Susan, I thank you for a very informative and very interactive webinar. I think it's been very helpful. We do have quite a few questions, as I anticipated, that we did not get to today, and we will respond to you offline on those. But thanks for attending our webinar. Thanks again, Susan. We truly appreciate it.
I'll do my best, but it's a very, very long, complicated regulatory framework, so I'll give as much as I could on it, and I hope it's helpful for people.
Right, and I think in the context of 60 minutes, you did cover a lot, which has been helpful. So we hope to see you in a future webinar, and until then, have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.